So, a while ago, I was wandering through Caelid whilst playing Elden Ring. Not really fighting anything, not progressing the story, just walking. The longer I stayed there, the more uncomfortable it felt. Not because something jumped out at me, but because the land itself felt wrong. The sky is tinted red, the ground looks infected. Creatures are alive, but barely. It doesn't feel like a battlefield. It feels contaminated. And that's what stuck with me. Scarlet Rot in Elden Ring isn't presented like a magical curse you just cleanse and move on from. It feels persistent, environmental, almost biological. So I started wondering, if something like this existed outside a fantasy world, would it actually behave like a real disease? So, if you haven't played Elden Ring, here's the quick version. Scarlet Rot is basically a disease you get from being in the wrong place for too long. The longer you're exposed to it, the worse it gets. Even when you leave the area, the damage keeps ticking for a bit, and even if you come back, it starts right back up like nothing changed. Now, what makes it interesting is that it's not just limited to people. It exists in the ground, in water, in animals, and across entire regions of the world. There are places in the game that aren't temporarily infected or dangerous right now, they're just permanently like that. And unlike most diseases we usually think about, Scarlet Rot isn't something you pass to someone else. There's no coughing, sneezing, or close contact involved. You don't catch it from a person, you run into it by being somewhere that already has it. That difference ends up kind of being the key to everything else, because once you start thinking about disease as something environmental instead of contagious, the real world comparisons become a lot clearer. Once you start looking for those comparisons, Scarlet Rot lines up surprisingly well with something that's called a chronic environmental fungal disease. Now, that sounds technical, but it's a simple idea. Some diseases don't spread quickly, don't burn themselves out, and don't live inside human bodies. They live inside the environment itself, and people get sick by interacting with that environment. Now, fungal diseases work exactly like this, and they're much more common than people tend to assume. Around 300 million people worldwide live with serious fungal infections, and somewhere between 2.5 and 3.8 million deaths each year are linked to them. In severe cases, especially where treatment is limited, invasive fungal infections can be extremely dangerous. They don't get much attention because they're not explosive. They don't arrive all at once or dominate headlines. They just linger in the background, slowly becoming part of everyday life, which is part of why Scarlet Rot feels less like fantasy and more like something we've seen before. Now, one of the smartest choices Elden Ring makes is showing that Scarlet Rot isn't just a personal illness, it's something that affects the world itself. There's an entire region called Caelid where the land is visibly diseased. Plants don't really die as much as grow wrong. Animals are still alive, but aggressive and unstable. Life continues, but it's clearly under strain. That's actually very, very close to what fungal damage looks like in real ecosystems. A fungus called chytrid, for example, has helped push more than 500 amphibian species towards extinction. and white nose syndrome wiped out huge portions of bat populations in some regions. And even when outbreaks slow down, the ecosystems they hit often don't fully recover for decades. Scarlet Rot doesn't leave behind a wasteland per se. It leaves behind a world that technically still functions, just not very well. And that idea becomes important when you think about how something like this would move through our own world. If Scarlet Rot existed in the real world, it wouldn't spread the way we usually picture disease outbreaks. There wouldn't be a single patient zero or sudden global spike where everything changes overnight. Instead, it would move quietly through contaminated soil, standing water, certain airborne particles, open wounds, long-term skin contact, and animals that unknowingly carry it from place to place. Now that's how real fungal diseases behave. You wouldn't catch it from a stranger sitting right next to you. You'd pick it up by spending time in the wrong environment, often without realizing it until much later. And that slower timeline changes what the outcome would actually look like. Now, the next part sounds reassuring at first, but really isn't. Scarlet Rot doesn't usually kill quickly. In Elden Ring, people live with it for years, and medically that makes sense. In the real world, a disease called tuberculosis can remain dormant from anywhere from 5 to 30 years. Chronic fungal infections often require lifelong treatment, and long-term illness tends to cause more suffering overall than sudden outbreaks. So instead of mass extinction, you'd see something slower and messier. You'd have more disability, more chronic pain and fatigue, and healthcare systems that are constantly under pressure rather than overwhelmed all at once. It wouldn't be the end of everything. It would be the beginning of a long decline. Within the game, there is a particular character who is known for being intertwined with Scarlet Rot. She is also known as the Goddess of Rot, and many players will recognize her as Malenia is a character who's permanently affected by Scarlet Rot. Now, you don't need to know her full story to understand what's happening to her. Her body isn't failing all at once, it's locked in an ongoing internal fight. That's very similar to something called an autoimmune disease, where the immune system slowly damages the body over time. In the real world, autoimmune conditions affect roughly 5 to 8% of the global population. They have no permanent cures and tend to flare up under stress. And this makes sense because when Malenia fights, her condition worsens. That's not some dramatic game mechanic. It's actually a very realistic way to show what chronic illness looks like, especially when stress pushes symptoms further. In Elden Ring, fire can be used as something that can temporarily push back Scarlet Rot, and that's one of those details that feels symbolic until you think about it. Heat does destroy fungal spores. In real life, controlled burns are sometimes used to reduce fungal contamination in environments. They can lower spore counts for a while, but reinfection is common, especially if the underlying conditions don't change. So fire doesn't solve the problem. It just creates a window where things are a little more manageable, which is exactly how it functions in the game. Fungal infections are notoriously difficult to treat because fungi are biologically similar to humans. That makes it hard to target them without harming the patient as well. Right now, there are fewer than 20 major antifungal drugs in use, but many of them come with serious side effects. and drug-resistant fungal infections can have very high mortality rates. So, if Scarlet Rot existed, it probably wouldn't have a clean, permanent cure. Treatment would be about slowing it down, managing symptoms, and trying to keep it from getting worse, which is why Elden Ring treats it as something you live with rather than something you permanently defeat. So, to answer the final question, would it kill us all? Well, probably not. But it also wouldn't be something humanity could just solve and move past. A disease like Scarlet Rot would change where people live, which jobs are dangerous, who has access to treatment, and which regions are hit hardest. Over time, it wouldn't feel like a crisis anymore. It would just feel normal, which is more or less what happens in the lands between. Scarlet Rot is unsettling because it doesn't behave like a magical curse or a cartoon villain. It behaves the way a real disease does. Slow, persistent, tied to environments, and resistant to permanent solutions. If something like that existed in the real world, it wouldn't wipe us out. It would just stick around, quietly reshaping how we live. And that's why, in a game full of gods and monsters, Scarlet Rot ends up feeling strangely familiar.